Hi everybody, this is just a short little video on the history of behaviorism. So I only have one objective for you guys, to know the historical development of behaviorism. And then our agenda for this little video is that we're going to talk about Pavlov, Watson, Skinner, the cognitive revolution, and then the start of ABA, or applied behavior analysis. So let's get started with some history. Behaviorism started way back with Pavlov. And this was in the early 1900s, and Pavlov was actually a Russian physiologist, and he was working on the digestive systems of animals, specifically dogs. And so he would hook up this little device right here, and he would put food in the dog's mouth and see how much the dog salivated. What he was finding was that when the dog would hear the experimenter's footsteps, that the dog would automatically start salivating to the footsteps, and the food didn't even have to be presented in the dog's mouth. So this started the basis for Pavlov's classical conditioning paradigm. So in the paradigm, we have food, which we call the unconditioned stimulus, and food automatically elicits salivation. Salivation to the food is the unconditioned response. Now, Pavlov would then pick a neutral object, and I have bell as an example here, but they actually show that he didn't really use bells, but I'm going to use this for our example here. He had a bell that was neutral, so he would ring the bell, and the dog would not salivate, no conditioned response, and then he would start pairing the bell with a food, and this would be the conditioning process. So he would present bell then food, the dog would salivate, bell then food, the dog would salivate, and eventually the bell by itself would elicit the salivation. So now, after this conditioning process, the bell has become the conditioned stimulus, and the salivation to the bell has become the conditioned response. When you guys see the word unconditioned, this means that it's due to our evolutionary history. So no learning has to take place. We're born with the fact that food will elicit salivation in our mouths. So that's why food is the unconditioned stimulus, which elicits salivation from the food as the unconditioned response. Now, the bell that was originally neutral has now been conditioned, so there's learning that has to occur for the bell to elicit the salivation, and that's why the bell is a conditioned stimulus, and the salivation is to the bell is the conditioned response. And this is the whole classical conditioning paradigm. Now, this paradigm is referred to by 3 different names, depending upon which psychologist you talk to. It can be called classical conditioning, it can be called Pavlovian conditioning, and it can be called respondent conditioning. If you talk to people that really study classical conditioning, they typically say classical or Pavlovian. If you talk to behavior analysts, they're going to say respondent conditioning. And I'm going to talk about the reasons why in a second. So, because this class focuses on ABA and behavior analysis, I want you guys to start using respondent conditioning to refer to this paradigm instead of the classical or Pavlovian conditioning names. A couple key things in respondent conditioning: the behaviors are reflexive and involuntary. So you guys are going to hear me say that food elicits a response, or a stimulus elicits a response. When you see the word elicit, that means it's a reflex, it's involuntary. Food elicits salivation. After conditioning, the bell elicits salivation as well. Reflexive, involuntary. All right, so let's apply classical conditioning really quick. If you guys ever get nervous when you go to the dentist and you see the chair, I know that I do. I even get nervous when I walk in the waiting room. But you guys see the chair and you might feel this kind of fear and anxiety. So I want you guys to think about that and try to apply the classical conditioning or the respondent conditioning paradigm. Sorry. So I want you guys to try and pick out your unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, conditioned stimulus, and conditioned response. And I like to draw mine out, but I would, if you guys want to, pause the video right now and try and figure it out, and then replay it once you guys have an answer. But in general, the dentist chair is neutral, so at the beginning of all this, it does not elicit any type of fear and anxiety. You typically have some type of dentist tool that gets stuck in your mouth, so the tool elicits pain. So the tool is going to be your unconditioned stimulus. The pain from the tool is going to be your unconditioned response. You have the dentist chair that was neutral. It gets paired with the tools, which elicit the pain, and eventually the dentist chair itself is going to elicit fear and anxiety, or that conditioned response. So now every time you see the dentist chair, you typically might feel that fear and anxiety. So unconditioned, due to our evolutionary history, put tools in your mouth, it elicits pain. The dentist chair, probably originally neutral, Now it gets paired with the tools, and now the dentist chair elicits that conditioned response, which is that fear and anxiety. Take note that in our previous example with salvation, the unconditioned response and conditioned response were very similar. But if you have something like pain, a dentist chair is not going to elicit pain, but it will elicit fear and anxiety as a result of that unconditioned stimulus eliciting pain. So after Pavlov, Watson came up around 1920, and he was an actual psychologist, and he started looking at the topic that psychologists are studying. And at this time, psychologists were studying the mind. And Watson argued, hey, we can't see the mind, we can't measure it, so we shouldn't be focusing on the mind. We should be focusing on something that we can see and we can measure, which would be observable behavior. So Watson is kind of deemed the father of behaviorism because he really changed the study of psychology from the mind to behavior and really promoted more of a natural science approach to psychology, using the scientific method and things like that. Watson actually took Pavlov's respondent conditioning paradigm and implemented it with humans with regards to emotional behavior. And Watson's type of psychology is referred to as SR psychology, stimulus response psychology. There's a stimulus that elicits a response. And Watson really got a name for himself, like I said, around 1920 when he did his research on little Albert. Little Albert was a little boy, and basically he was a really happy little boy, and they showed putting a bunch of different items in front of him, a white rat, a bunny, a monkey, even a burning newspaper, and he was really happy. So Watson decided to pair a white rat with a loud bang. Now the bang by itself elicited some crying and emotional responding from little Albert. So he was scared of the bang. He would hear the bang and it would elicit this crying response. So he paired white rat, which was originally neutral, with the bang, and after a couple of pairings, about 7 times, the white rat itself elicited the conditioned response, which was crying. And you guys can click on this picture right here and it'll pull up the video because Watson actually filmed all of his experiments with little Albert, so you guys can see that. And from today, this experiment would actually not get past IRB. It was controversial with regards to ethics, but it did really push science forward, and that up until this point, our cause of emotional responding, the main interpretation was Freud's, which is just something in your unconscious seeping up and producing that fear and anxiety. And Watson actually showed that emotional responding is a conditioned response. It's a learned behavior, which was really interesting for the time. Now, about this time, Skinner started to come up, and Skinner started to think about what Watson was doing and what Pavlov had done, and he thought about the fact that he didn't really think that completely explained behavior, because after you engage in the response, something happens in the environment afterwards. So Skinner kind of focused on the consequences of behavior, and he talks about how learning is controlled by the consequences. So if we engage in a behavior and we get a positive consequence, that behavior is more likely to occur. If we engage in behavior and get a negative consequence, that behavior is less likely to occur. So Skinner came up with what he called operant conditioning. All of our animal research is based off of operant conditioning. He taught pigeons to play ping pong. You guys can click on this video right here. It's a cute little bird. She does lots of cool things with regards to, and was taught through operant conditioning. And Skinner actually did tons of research with rats and pigeons in a Skinner box and came up with a bunch of different principles of behavior, so reinforcement, punishment, extinction, things like that, schedules of reinforcement. And he wrote all about them in his book, Behavior of Organisms, in 1938, and he labeled this the experiment analysis of behavior. Experimental analysis of behavior, or EAB. So this was all laid out around 1938. And when he talks about operant conditioning, like I said before, the behavior increases or decreases as a result of its consequences. So a rat in a Skinner box, press the lever, gets food. In the future, the rat is more likely to press the lever. So this type of psychology was deemed SRS psychology, so stimulus response stimulus psychology. And with operant conditioning, the behaviors are goal-directed and voluntary. So remember with respondent, it's a reflex, they're elicited. Operant behaviors are voluntary. So we say that we emit behaviors. So an organism will emit a behavior. So you guys can tell if I'm talking about respondent or operant with the terms that I use. If I talk about a stimulus eliciting a response, it's respondent. If I talk about a stimulus or an organism emitting a response, it's operant conditioning. So a couple of key terms that can help you differentiate the two. But operant conditioning was very prominent. Like I said, Skinner wrote his book, 1938, Behavior of Organisms. Around the 1950, behaviorism, operant conditioning was mainstream psychology. So if you went to grad school in 1950 for psychology, you were going to be working in an animal lab. You were probably a behaviorist doing research on learning theory. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about the difference between respondent and operant conditioning. So respondent conditioning, the response is elicited, so voluntary. Operant, the response is emitted. And then respondent, there's an association between the CS and the US, and the organism responds to that association, essentially. And then operant, there's an association between behavior and consequences. So the organism emits a behavior and gets a particular consequence. Now, I want to talk about the terms respondent and operant. These are the terms that Skinner used, so these are the terms that we use in behavior analysis. He referred to the classical conditioning paradigm as respondent conditioning because the organism responds to the environment. And he talks about operant conditioning as operant because the organism operates on the environment. So it's all about the behavior of the organism, whether the organism responds to the environment or operates on the environment as to whether it's respondent or operant. Okay, one other thing I wanted to point out is I talked about SR psychology for Pavlov and Watson, so stimulus response psychology, and then we talked about SRS for Skinner, stimulus response stimulus. Although these have similar terms, they actually are implied a little bit differently. So with stimulus response, that's that respondent conditioning paradigm. You have a loud bang and it elicits a jump in you. This is reflexive and voluntary. So we say that the loud bang elicits the jump. SRS is still stimulus response, and then you add that stimulus, but it's a little different. So the stimulus would be something like, the first stimulus would be something like the teacher says jump. The response would be a jump, but you may or may not jump. It's voluntary, it's not reflexive. And then the stimulus at the end would be the consequence. So if you jumped, a praise in this example. This first stimulus is what we call an antecedent because it occurs before the response. But the two antecedents are different in that one elicits a behavior and one sets the occasion for a behavior to occur. All right, so behaviorism, alive and well in the 1950s, but people around the 1960s started to get a little frustrated with the behavioral perspective. The behavioral perspective says that the cause of the behavior is in the environment. So we're always looking at these behavior-environment relations, and there isn't any room for mental processes. And people were getting a little frustrated with that. So around the 1970s, cognitive psychology started to come up, and we call it the cognitive revolution. So it kind of overshadowed behaviorism. In cognitive psychology, they still study behavior, but the cause of that behavior is a mental process. And there was actually a really big fight between Skinner and a famous cognitive psychologist named Noam Chomsky. Skinner used to do a lot of writing on theoretical concepts of behaviorism, or theoretical concepts of applying the basic principles of learning. And Skinner wrote a book on language in 1957. And Chomsky read it and critiqued it and kind of just destroyed it and wrote an article about it and things like that. And Skinner basically read Chomsky's review and decided that Chomsky did not understand behaviorism, didn't understand the basic behavioral principles, and didn't feel like it justified another article to respond back to Chomsky's article. And so since Skinner never replied back, people kind of took Chomsky's article and ran with it, and so cognitive psychology grew and became mainstream psychology. And to this day, there's still a big battle between behaviorists and cognitive psychologists. I feel like it's gotten better, but it still is. It still is there and very prominent, especially with regards to language. But although cognitive psychology kind of took over in the 1970s, and it's still very prominent, when we talk about mainstream psychology, even today, we're still talking about cognitive psychology. But behaviorism wasn't completely dead. There was still a lot of people doing work with animals on the basic learning principles and things like that. I do want to take a second and talk about the differences, or one of the main differences between behavior theories and cognitive theories, and that is due to the cause of behavior. So for behavior theories, the cause of the behavior is in the environment, whereas cognitive theories, the cause of behavior is due to some type of mental activity of the learner. Now, Skinner urges us to use caution when we attribute behavior to a mental process, because we can't see or measure mental processes. So he calls these hypothetical constructs. And if we're attributing behavior to something that we can't see or measure, then that results in what he calls an explanatory fiction. Also, it results in what he calls circular reasoning. So you might have a kid that keeps getting out of his seat, and somebody might ask the teacher, why is he getting up and out of his seat? And the teacher might say, because he has ADHD. And they'll say, how do you know he has ADHD? And she'll say, because he can't sit in a seat. And they'll say, well, why can't he sit in a seat? And she'll say, because he has ADHD. And it goes in this circle, and you don't actually get to why the behavior is occurring. All right, so like I mentioned earlier, cognitive revolution, 1970s, really prominent, but behaviorism still wasn't dead, and there were still a lot of people doing research with animals on these learning principles. And so the question was, can we apply these basic learning principles to humans? And the answer was yes. One of the first reported instances of this was at a psychiatric hospital. They had a patient who was basically in a vegetative state, and they were able to have that person lift their arm by providing them a sucrose solution, which they really preferred. And so that was one of the first instances of us being able to modify behavior based on manipulating the environment. And since then, we had a bunch of research start to develop, and in 1968, we were able to produce the first journal of applied behavior analysis, which we call JAB. And in our first issue, Bayer, Wolf, and Risley wrote an article that lays out the dimensions of applied behavior analysis. And this is kind of the basis of our field. And I talk about these dimensions in the What is ABA lecture. But since 1968, our field has started to grow. We've had lots of prominent researchers come in and really start to develop and do a lot of really cool research. This is a slide from Dr. Carbone, but you guys can see here was 1968. Bayer, Wolf, and Risley published their current dimensions of applied behavior analysis, and that formally started our field. In 1970s, there was a guy named Jack Michael, and he took Skinner's book on language called Verbal Behavior, the one that he had the fight with Chomsky about, and really started to do research with verbal behavior. Mark Sundberg got involved, and they started producing a lot of research and started analysis of verbal behavior journal. And then we started to have some certification boards start to come up. Sundberg and Partington published some assessments to assess language and learning skills and things like that. And since then, our field has just really taken off and really grown. Probably within the past 2 decades, we have ABA clinics everywhere. We have lots of people getting interested in applied behavior analysis, becoming BCBAs, which is just really cool. So our field has really grown and taken off within the last 2 decades. So, all right, guys, we talked about Pavlov, Watson, Skinner. We talked about the difference between respondent and operant conditioning. We talked about the cognitive revolution, that little tip between Skinner and Chomsky, and then the start of ABA, which was officially started in 1968 by that first issue of JABA and that Bayer and colleagues article. All right, guys, thank you for watching and listening. If you guys have any questions, please email me. Thanks.